Hello, I'm Erik Wait, and this is lesson number 10 in our study of Bibliology. And in this lesson, we'll be looking at the transmission of the Bible. Basically, the history of the Bible and the history of the formation of manuscript families to down to basically two Greek texts from which we get all our English Bibles. Now, if you take a class in seminary or Bible college, in a semester, you're meeting a couple times a week with your class, with your professors for an hour and a half. So 2 to 3 hours of class a week in a semester is not enough to um, convey everything there is to know about the particular topic you're taking in seminary. So at the beginning of the semester, the professor is going to give you a long list of books to read. Might be 10 books plus perhaps supplemental books. Hey, here's some additional books to read. Typically, you got to write papers and you have a midterm exam and a final exam. But even all that, it's really just an introduction to the topic. The most a professor can do is introduce you to good authors and sort of steer you in the direction of how you should understand this particular topic. This is one of the most complicated, one of the most challenging, and probably hotly debated today, particularly of the two Greek manuscripts as well as English translations. We're going to get into English translations later on in this series. But before I go any further, I thought I would introduce you to a few books that I would highly recommend to supplement your study along with this video. Two are by Norman Geisler and William Nix. And of course, as books get republished and revised, the covers on them change. So this is A General Introduction to the Bible by Geisler and Nix. I'm not sure this is still in print, but it has basically been repeated in this book, From God to Us. But From God to Us is a thinner book, but it covers a lot of the same topics, a lot of the same material. And this book has actually been updated with a new cover. So Geisler and Nix, From God to Us. Now, just because I recommend a book or an author doesn't mean I agree with them on everything. Geisler, he's an evidentialist. He's much more Arminian and so forth. My background is in Presbyterian and Reformed thought. That being said, he's done his homework on this particular subject. This is an absolute must read. The Text of the New Testament by Bruce Metzger. Bruce Metzger, probably the most respected scholars in this field. And another is The Canon of Scripture by F. Bruce. Again, the cover of this book has been updated, and I highly, highly recommend not only this book, but anything by F. Bruce with his commentaries and so forth. I highly, highly, highly recommend. All right, so I want to begin this lesson with a quote from the Westminster Confession. If you're not familiar with the Westminster Confession, in short, you have continental Reformed churches, that is Calvinistic Reformed churches from Europe, and then you have the UK Reformed churches, Presbyterianism, which use the Westminster Confession of Faith, larger and shorter catechism as their statement of faith. The continental or European Reformed use the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgian Confession, and the Canons of Dort. So in the United States, they have an updated version or a revised version of the Westminster Confession in Presbyterian churches. Now, within Presbyterian churches, there's some 30-odd different Presbyterian churches here in the United States, and some of them are more liberal, which really don't represent Presbyterianism. And then you have those that are, I would say, more confessional, more historic, and more, I would say, more biblical. And I would be much more in line with those. So let's begin with the Westminster Confession of Faith, Chapter 1, Section 8. The Old Testament in Hebrew, which was the native language of the people of God of old, and the New Testament in Greek, which at the time of the writing of it was most generally known to the nations, being immediately inspired by God and by his singular care and providence, kept pure in all ages, are therefore authentic, so as in all controversies of religion, the church is finally to appeal to them. But because these original tongues are not known to all the peoples of God, who have a right unto and interest in scriptures, and are commanded in the fear of God to read and search them. Therefore, they are to be translated into the vulgar language of every nation unto which they come, that the word of God dwelling plentiful in all, they may worship him in acceptable manner, and through patience and comfort of the scriptures may have hope. So even if you're not Presbyterian or Reformed, I think that's, if you're a biblical Christian, you should be able to agree with that statement. There's also the London Confession of Faith, which is a sort of a Baptist version of the Westminster Confession. They basically took the Westminster Confession and then changed some parts of it so that's more in line with Baptist theology. Now, the statement in there about vulgar language, vulgar at the time meant common language. And I'll get into this later on, but the King James English was never a common or a vulgar language, and it's not today. It's a higher language in a sense. Now, the King James, I'm not going to get off into the King James only controversies, but King James is comes out of a particular family of manuscripts. So we're going to get into that towards the end of this lesson. And it is to be held in high regard for it. Providentially, it has been one of the primary texts used in much of the church, particularly in Western Christianity, as opposed to, say, the Greeks. And so it's a highly respected translation from a highly respected family of manuscripts. But I am not a King James only person. And there's even variances within the King James only camp. But again, we'll get to that in a future lesson. As always, we want to define our terms. The transmission of the Bible is that aspect of bibliology that deals with the questions of how did we get our modern Bible? Is my modern Bible truly reliable? Is there any one translation or version that is more reliable than another? These and other important questions will be addressed in this lesson. There are many questions that are now in process and will probably not be answered completely until further textual examination is completed. Consequently, there will continue to be differences of opinion on the subject. However, it is our intent here to examine the remarkable way that the original revelation of God has been faithfully transmitted to our modern translations, thereby providing a solid foundation of personal understanding and further comprehensive study. When we examine the history of the transmission of the Bible, we will primarily limit ourselves to the New Testament, for the Old Testament scriptures simply tagged along with the development of the New Testament Bible as far as the church is concerned. It is beyond the scope of this lesson to deal with all of the particulars of the transmission of the Old Testament text. The history of the New Testament may be divided into several basic time periods, which we will follow as we examine the transmission of the text. The period of production. This is our solid beginning, for it represents the time period in which the revelation of God was communicated by divine inspiration. Every document was written during this time period and eventually canonized in the Christian Bible. Due to the nature of inspiration, we began with a Bible that was absolutely infallible and inerrant in its original production. The period of duplication, up to 325 AD. This is a very critical step as we move away from the inspired autographs, for this time period represents the copying and duplication of both the autographs and early copies. There are several important factors that contribute to the development of the text during this time period, and one point especially to keep in mind is this. The original New Testament manuscripts were written under special conditions, under the inspiration of God, and the copies were made and preserved under special conditions, under the singular care and providence of God. One of the best ways to develop and defend the accurate copying of the New Testament text is through the writings of the Church Fathers. Although they do not represent a primary witness to the text of the New Testament, they do serve two very important secondary roles. First, they give overwhelming support to the existence of the 27 authoritative books of the New Testament canon. Second, their quotations are so numerous and widespread that if there were not New Testament manuscripts available, the New Testament could be reproduced from the writings of the early church fathers alone. There was a widespread copying of the New Testament before and during the time of the church fathers, and their use of the scripture coincides with the copies that we have from later dates. The development of New Testament copies. The multiplicity of manuscripts produces a corresponding number of variant readings. This is especially true of the New Testament as compared to the Old, for there were no official copies being made, as in the case with Israel. There are several very important questions that must be asked and answered in regards to the variant readings. For example, how many variants are there? The number continually increases due to the discovery of additional manuscripts, but the most recent count is that there are over 200,000 recognized and known variants in the New Testament manuscripts or copies. Second, how are the variants counted? In actuality, the number of variants is rather insignificant due to the manner in which they are counted. For example, if one single word were misspelled in 3,000 of the 5,000 manuscripts in existence today, it would be counted as 3,000 variants. In other words, if there was one manuscript, which was the mother of the entire family of 3,000 manuscripts, which were all copied from the mother text, then any single variant would be duplicated 3,000 times. Is this then really 3,000 variants? Or one singular variant duplicated 3,000 times, while in actuality it is really a singular variant duplicated 3,000 times. It is recorded as 3,000 variants. When this methodology is taken into consideration, the number of the actual singular variants from which the others are copied and accounted is very few. Finally, how do the variants occur? There are two ways for variants to occur in the text. First, by unintentional changes of various kinds. For example, there were errors of the eye that resulted in wrong divisions of words that actually resulted in the formation of entirely different words. Early manuscripts were written in all uppercase letters with no spaces between the words, no verse numeration, and no punctuation. Consequently, a phrase such as "he is now here," or "Heisnowhere," could be either "he is now here" or "he is nowhere." Also, at times, there was an omission of a letter, words, or an entire line of the text. This is probably due to the reader copying word for word and accidentally skipping a line while copying. While the manuscripts were in Greek, later scribes might be assigned to copy the manuscripts who did not read Greek and thus would not recognize the missing phrase. Another form is the repetition of letters, words, and even entire lines of a text. Perhaps a scribe was copying a text, and when he had to leave for a moment to answer a knock at the door, and upon returning, he accidentally repeated a line, or his eye misread or reread the same line twice when copying. In fact, I have a book written by R.C. Sproul, and there's an entire paragraph repeated in it. And I remember when I was, like you're reading a book and your mind wanders, you start thinking about something, and then you come back and you start reading, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, I already read this page. I already read this paragraph. You're rereading it. Or you answer the phone, you come back to it, you start reading, oh, I've already read this before. So as I'm reading this, I'm like, oh, I already read this. And then I looked at and I examined, no, there's two of the same paragraph in the book. In the book. It happens. It happens. Even with modern computers and modern editors and all the rest of that, you can accidentally repeat a sentence or repeat um, a whole paragraph, or spell checkers. Of course, modern today, spell checkers can not recognize a word and insert a word that actually wasn't there. In fact, so the word that means the mind, noetic. there is a doctrine referred to as the noetic effect of sin, and that is the effect of sin on the mind. So R.C. Sproul, who was one of my professors when I was at Westminster, he was a guest professor there. He had in a book the noetic effect of sin, and I don't know whether it was an editor or an automatic corrector or something like that, changed the word noetic to poetic. So it said the poetic effect of sin. So even in our modern era and all our fancy technology, typos and errors can still be in a text. Another common variant is the transposition or reversal of two letters or words. There are other confusions regarding misspellings, abbreviations, insertion of Scrabble notes, etc. So a Scrabble note would be he's copying something, and then he makes a comment on the side margin, and then a later scribe would think, oh, the previous scribe forgot to put this in the text, and so he wrote it off to the side. So then the next scribe takes that and then feeds it into the text, thinking it was a typo and meant to be in the text. So there are a few like that as well. There are errors of the ear that occurred when manuscripts were copied by dictation. In these cases, a singular person would read a text while several scribes made copies, and thus the scribe inserted a word that sounded like the word that is being spoken. Modern examples would be the different spellings in wood, or sea, or ate, or weather, and so forth. Another error was that of memory, which were not very common, but may have occurred as a scribe forgot the precise word of a passage and thus substituted a synonym or similar sounding word. Some were errors of judgment and may have occurred as scribes would work in poor conditions or for extra long hours. Or an error of writing could occur if a scribe wrote indistinctly, that is, he had poor handwriting, which would then set in motion future errors from those who copied his text. Second is by intentional changes for various reasons. There may be grammatical and linguistic style differences between the various copyists, and over the course of time, a scribe may modify the text at some point, seeking to bring it into conformity with the style of his time period. In addition, liturgical changes were common. For example, a given lectionary may incorporate a prologue that summarized the preceding reading. A lectionary would be a text that's used in a public forum, particularly in a church. And so, for liturgical reasons, someone would write a prologue or introduction to the text that's supposed to be read. So that introduction was never intended to be added into the text, but later somebody did. It's kind of like, imagine if somebody was if you have a study Bible that has notes, or maybe you've written notes on the side of your Bible, and someone using your copy with your handwritten notes and thinking it's supposed to be in there and add it in there. It's sort of like that. At times, there are harmonization changes. Scribes copying a particular gospel may recall the same story in another gospel and account by memory and say to himself, oh, I remember this story, and then copy the story as it is written in another gospel, thus resulting in harmonization. This may also have been done intentionally in order to fix what was perceived as an error or conflict between gospel accounts. Another intentional change would be a historical or factual change in which two or more variants are combined into a single variant. Thus, two families of text with two separate variants are then duplicated in a copy that is made from both texts. Finally, at times, there are doctrinal changes that are generally in the direction of orthodoxy, with the scribe seeking to make the text more expressive of truth in order to combat the heretical teachings prevalent in his time, such as the Comma Johannem reference to the Trinity in 1 John 5:7, or the reference to walking in the Spirit in Romans 8:1. How significant are these variants? That is a serious question that must not be ignored by those who hold the Bible in high regard. Although there are about 200,000 known variants, they occur in only 10,000 places. So obviously, the next question is, how significant are those 10,000 places? The question may be answered by the following critics. Westcott and Hort estimate that only about 1/8 of the variants had any weight, such as spelling or style, and only about 1/16 rise above the level of triviality. Thus, they concluded our New Testament text is about 98.33% pure. Philip Schaff surmised that only about 400 variants affected the sense of any text, and of those, only 50 were of any significance, with none of them affecting an article of faith. A.T. Robinson suggested that only about 1,000th of the New Testament was affected in any way, thus it is 99.9% free of any concern. While we readily admit to the problem of the variants in the New Testament texts or copies, at the same time, we readily defend the integrity and purity of the text, recognizing that it is extremely well intact for such an ancient document. In addition, with further textual criticism studies being undertaken, we are very confident that we will increasingly approximate the actual text of the original autographs. The development of manuscript families. Although this is a recent means to distinguish between the ancient documents, going back to the 18th century, it does reveal the distinctions and similarities between the early manuscript types. There are three that we must consider. The Western family consists of the New Testament documents that contain that form of text found in the writings of the Western Church Fathers, such as Irenaeus, Tertullian, Cyprian, and so forth. Another is the Alexandrian family, which consists of those New Testament documents that contain the form of the text found in the writings of those who lived in Alexandria, such as Origen and many papyri texts. Westcott and Hort felt that Papyri B, which they called the neutral text, was remarkably pure and uncontaminated by the errors of either the Western or Alexandrian family of manuscripts. Finally, the traditional family, or Byzantine, includes all those New Testament documents that contain the Byzantine text. The vast majority of manuscripts belong to this family, and the quotations of Chrysostom, however you want to pronounce that, and the other church fathers of Antioch seem to correspond to this text. It is from these manuscript families that we must trace the transmission of the New Testament text. For all the versions, revisions, and translations may be traced back to a particular manuscript family. The question then becomes, is one of the families superior to the others, or do they all essentially reflect the New Testament text in spite of their unique variants? The period of standardization of the text, 325 to 1500 AD. This is a time period in which we witness the church faithfully copying the New Testament text from existing manuscript families. There are two predominant results that must be identified. The first is the production of the Hebrew Masoretic text, which remains to this day the authoritative text of the Old Testament. The second is the standardization of the Greek Byzantine text, which, for the most part, became the accepted textual form of the New Testament. Once the standardized text was developed, there was little need for classification and critical evaluation of the earlier manuscripts of the text. As a result, the text remained relatively unchanged throughout the entire period, for the standardization had been the result of a comparison and mixing of these earlier manuscripts. The period of crystallization of the text, from 1500 to 1648 AD. This period is primarily characterized by the further development of the Byzantine manuscript family, the Textus Receptus, and the English Bible. We will begin by examining the development of the English Bible, for it is along these lines that we will see most clearly the Greek textual preferences. One of the most significant developments in this period is that of the English Bible and the Textus Receptus. The following is probably the best way to trace exactly how the English Bible came into existence and how it relates to the standardized text that had been accepted for the previous millennium. John Wycliffe provided the first translation of the Bible into English, but his work was based upon the Latin Vulgate, for he did not know either the Greek or Hebrew languages. 1382. Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, a Dutch scholar and humanist, published his Greek New Testament text, which was primarily based upon the Latin Vulgate and a few Byzantine manuscripts. This became the basis for the Textus Receptus in 1516. William Tyndale is considered to be the true father of the English Bible. He had a working knowledge of both Hebrew and Greek and translated the Bible into English from ancient Greek manuscripts, some of which had been used by Erasmus in 1525. These were then followed by the Coverdale's translation, which was based upon the Latin Vulgate, Paganini's Latin version, Luther's German Bible, and 2 editions of William Tyndale's English Bible in 1535. This was followed by the Matthew's Bible, which combined the Tyndale and Coverdale Old Testaments with the 1535 revision of Tyndale's New Testament to make another version in 1537. This was followed by the Taverner's Bible, which was an attempt to improve on the Greek translation of William Tyndale in 1539. This was followed by another version of the Matthew's Bible, which became known as the Great Bible. This work of revision was directed by Coverdale and was authorized by the government and the church in 1539. This was followed by what was to become the most popular Bible of the century, the Geneva Bible. It was called such because it was published in Geneva due to the widespread Christian persecution that was taking place in England. The basic text for this Bible was not the previous Great Bible, but rather the Old Tyndale translation. This was also the first English Bible that was written in the chapter and verse style in 1560. This was followed by the Bishop's Bible, which was simply a revision of the Great Bible. It rose in popularity due to the Anglican rejection of the Calvinistic notes contained in the Geneva Bible, which was used extensively by the Reformers, Puritans, and American Pilgrims, and their accreditation of the new revision in 1568. This was followed by the King James Version, which was primarily based upon the 1516 and 1522 editions of Erasmus's Greek text. It is also interesting to note that this translation was never really authorized. This is simply an assumption that is taken from the title page, which read, "Appointed to be read in churches," meaning it was replacing the Bishop's Bible for public use. Also, the King James Version is not really a version, but rather a translation. It is actually the 5th revision of Tyndale's version and the first revision of the 1602 edition of the Bishop's Bible. Much of the translation of William Tyndale's Bible is reflected in the King James Bible of 1611. And just a note, Desiderius Erasmus, the scholar who put together what was the Greek text that would support of the King James Version, was not a Protestant. At first, he was in support of Martin Luther in terms of moral reform of the church, but then against Martin Luther in terms of the errors of the doctrines of grace of the Roman Catholic Church. So, essentially, in the background, the Greek text for the King James Version is a Roman Catholic scholar. The period of criticism and revisions regarding the text, 1648 to present. Although textual criticism, that is, lower criticism, has always played an important part in our understanding the New Testament text, it assumed a dominant role during this time period. Lower criticism is not to be confused with higher criticism, which is associated with the anti-supernatural presuppositions of German liberalism. Rather, lower criticism seeks to discover the best manuscripts and texts and consider such things as the dates, authorship, materials used, style of writing, and so forth in order to determine the original reading. We now want to briefly examine the impact of these textual studies. So we start off with the Byzantine family manuscripts and an Alexandrian family manuscripts. From these, we get two Greek texts, as these manuscripts are put together to form a singular Greek text. There's the Textus Receptus, also known as the TR or Majority Text MT, Greek New Testament. And then we have the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament. And then from these two different Greek texts, we have from the Textus Receptus, we have the King James Version and the New King James Version. And from the Nestle-Aland, we have the ERV, ASV, RSV, NEB, NASB, and NIV. So as you can see, the basic differences producing these results is one of manuscript or textual preference. The Textus Receptus uses primarily Byzantine family of manuscripts, whereas the Nestle-Aland uses the Alexandrian family. And in case you're wondering which do I use, I have them both. This is the majority text, and this is the Nestle-Aland text. This is the one we were issued in or told to use in seminary, and this is one that I sort of more or less grew up with. And the funny thing is about this majority text, this particular printing of it, I actually prefer this for just the text type. I find the text type easier to read, and particularly in my later days, as my eyes are not what they used to be. But these days, oftentimes, if I'm looking something up, if I'm not too lazy, just go around and spin around and grab one of those, I'll just bring it up on a computer and I can enlarge the size of the print all I want, as well as do cut and paste into documents when I'm writing something. And while we're at it, let's make a mention about the interlinears, in case you happen to have one. This is an interlinear. It's a cheat tool. Reading the English underneath the Greek text is not the same thing as reading the Greek text. All this is a shortcut to see what English word corresponds to the Greek term, but even then, it's not the same thing. So if you have an interlinear, while it can be a cheat tool, it's not a substitute for studying the original languages. Nor is Logos Bible software or any other program you got out there on the internet. There's no substitute for studying the original languages, and even more than that, and I'll get into this in another lesson, we'll get into this in hermeneutics, as well as our discussion of English translations, is the issue of language theory and understanding how human language works. The questions that must be asked are, what led to the development of the alternate textual position? And is this text a valid one for modern Bible translations? The following is probably the best way to trace exactly how the text resulting from lower criticism came into existence. Two Cambridge scholars, B.F. Westcott and F.J.A. Hort, spent over 30 years examining all the Greek manuscripts available at the time, from 1850 to 1881. In 1881, they published a completely revised edition of the New Testament text in 2 volumes. The first contained the text itself, and the second contained various notes on selected textual readings. The genealogical theory divided the textual materials into 4 types: the Syrian, Western, Neutral, and Alexandrian. The Syrian text type included the Syrian, Antiochian, and Byzantine texts. This approach also included the extensive use of the Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, 2 of the oldest and most complete manuscripts dating back to the 4th century. Having examined how this text of the New Testament was developed, we should ask the question, what was the response to the work by Westcott and Hort? Obviously, there were mixed reviews, with the work being hailed by many as pure genius and by others as pure heresy. The following represents the 2 schools of thought. Those rejecting the new critical text argue that the traditional text, the Textus Receptus, served the church for 1,500 years and must be correct because of its duration. The traditional text had hundreds of manuscripts in its favor, whereas the critical text only had a few early ones, and it is argued that the traditional text is actually superior because it is older. Those favoring the new critical text argue that the critical text was developed by the most careful and scholarly methodology, with no piece of evidence ever going unnoticed, and no legitimate authority not being brought into perspective. Discoveries made since the time of Westcott and Hort have tended to confirm their type of text while opposing the Textus Receptus. For example, the Papyrus Codex discoveries seem to confirm their conclusions. Thus, it would appear that the Alexandrian text is the better family because of the age and absence of harmonization of readings. In conclusion, there are two recognized manuscript textual lines of the New Testament text. There are those, of course, who prefer one above the other, even to the point of contending that only one is really authentic. These often base their arguments more upon tradition, emotional persuasion, and personal opinion, and are usually associated with the Textus Receptus line and the King James Version. They even go to the point of attacking the theology and lifestyle of Westcott and Hort and attempt to discredit them, and in doing so, to discredit their work. But they fail to recognize that these are not necessarily pertinent issues when dealing with the Greek language and Greek manuscripts. On the other hand, those who are convinced of the validity of the critical text are now making a sound appeal to realism and sensibility, and all the more so in the light of mounting evidences in favor of their textual preference. So, in the light of file analysis, who is right? In the light of the providence of God, we have the Textus Receptus, which has served the church so well for hundreds of years. With the introduction of the Westcott and Hort critical text, we have a great scholarly contribution to the entire field of textual study, and a text that is developed from an entirely different set of manuscripts. Thus, in the final analysis, there is no substantial difference between these texts. Their differences are mainly technical and methodological, not doctrinal, for the textual variants are doctrinally inconsequential. Therefore, we should rest on the solid foundation of Scripture, for our New Testament text has substantial report from two different families of texts, both ancient and numerous. Since the textual variances of the New Testament amount to only 1,000th of the text, which has no effect on doctrine, we ought not to major on the minors. We ought to focus on the Bible as the authoritative Word of God, rather than fight amongst ourselves on the minutiae of textual differences. So there are people out there, and I highly respect them, who spend a whole lot of time debating and arguing over this issue, calling each other heretics and so forth. There are people who spend loads and loads and loads of their time in the King James only camp. Now, I'll get more into this when I talk about English translations later on. If you have a preference for one particular family of manuscripts, and consequently you have a preference or a higher regard for the King James only, I have no quarrel with you whatsoever. I only have a problem with those, and this is very strange, who want to argue that the King James Version is a new autographa, a new text by which now everyone, if you're going to further the gospel in non-English speaking countries, those people now need to learn English and only read the King James Version. That is going contrary to Jesus and the apostles. As I mentioned in a previous lesson, when Jesus was reading in the synagogue, reading the book of Isaiah, he was not reading the autographa, he's reading a copy. As I mentioned before in previous lessons, copies were made of the people of old, the Old Covenant community, and they had copies at synagogues. And they would take them out of a box, unroll it. The box is called an ark, by the way. Unroll it and read the text. They would also use the Septuagint. Due to the captivity of the nation of Israel, Hebrew was no longer their first language, Because the Hellenization of the region, Greek was the primary language. It was the lingua franca. And so they would read the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Many of the citations of the Old Testament in the New Testament are actually quoting the Septuagint. So if Jesus is quoting or reading a copy, and then the apostles who write the New Testament are quoting a translation, the Septuagint, and you want to say, no, those aren't sufficient. The Septuagint isn't sufficient. Those copies, and we need a new autographa, well, with the King James Version being the new autographa that has some, secret code, mathematical code, in it, proving that it is in this newly inspired text. That is cultic. That's, I believe, it's heretical, and you're forming a King James only cult, a King James only cult that cannot be defended. And typically, these people who hold that view, when you want to make an appeal to the Greek translation, they do not care what the Greek text says, because they hold to a King James only version. Just that is their new inspired text. I'll get into this in another lesson when we talk about English translations. But there are translation errors in the King James text. I would say less than perfect. Less than perfect translations in the King James on the text, as well as all the rest of them, NIV, New American Standard, RSV, whatever else. Because translating from one language into another is quite a challenge, and you have to make a decision as to the readability of the English text. You can make it too wooden, or how tight you are word for word and how you're doing the translation. But again, we'll get that into another lesson. All right, I hope you found this beneficial. If you haven't watched the previous lessons, I highly recommend it, because everything in each lesson is built on previous lessons. And while there's some overlap from lesson to lesson, you really should, because the foundation for this lesson was set by the previous lessons. In fact, this entire course is going to be a foundation for the next class we'll have that I'll teach, which will be a class on hermeneutics. All right, I hope you benefited from this, and until next time, may the Lord richly bless you.